Hi guys, today we're looking at a Pentax P3. The P3s were the US version, the P30s were sold overseas. Same camera, just a different designation. It turns out that in the end many P30s were also sold in the United States. This cost me $30 with a macro lens. It's in excellent condition. The value on eBay for one of these is about $30 without a lens. This was an early P3 model, which is a little bit different than the later ones. The only significant thing I found that's different from the later P3s is there was a remote release socket right here on the collar of the lens that's not present on the early versions. The personal significance of this is that I would normally never want to collect a camera that's this modern and this new. But this one I just couldn't resist. It has a lot of charm. It has some plastic in it, but it's still pretty much an all-metal camera. Historically, it became the go-to camera for generations of enthusiasts who wanted to grow up their skills with a single lens reflex, but purchase an inexpensive and not overly complex camera. These were sold from 1985 to 1997. And they sold over 3 million of these things. Later models were assembled in China. The original P3s came from Japan. The later models had more plastic and less metal. More plastic and less metal. The next model after this was a P30N, and then a P30T, and then eventually there was a P5 and a P50. But from 10 feet away, they all looked alike. Let me show you some of the controls and features of this. This is the shutter speed dial, and it works as you would expect. You just dial it for the shutter speed you want. And on this lens, this is the aperture ring, and again, you just dial it for whatever setting you want. So in this mode, it's a completely manual camera, and if you look through the viewfinder, you'll see the setting that it chooses for the shutter speed, and then you dial it so that it matches. So you would essentially be an aperture priority mode because you would set the aperture and then it would show you the correct shutter speed to go with that aperture. It also has a completely automatic mode, which is kind of interesting, but it requires a special lens. The lens that was probably shipped with most of them enabled a completely automatic mode. The non-Pentax lenses, this is a non-Pentax lens, were a little bit different and weren't 100% compatible with the camera. So if you rotate this lens all the way to f22 and then hold down this release button and move it one more notch, it goes into program mode, which on this particular lens is not quite as useful as you would think. What happens now is it will automatically select the appropriate shutter speed. It doesn't matter where you put this dial. Once you're in program mode, you're in program mode. But in this case, if it was the Pentax lens, it would select the appropriate aperture and shutter speed both. But since this is a non-Pentax lens, what it really does is it leaves this one wide open at f2.8, and it selects the appropriate shutter speed to go with it. So let me show you the rest of this camera. Here's the film counter dial. On the left is the rewind, which is actually much neater than most rewind knobs. You'll notice there is no hump. It completely recesses into the body to make this a smaller, better handling camera in your hands. This is the power switch. I'll show you a close-up of that. One push turns the power on. Now this requires two L44 batteries, and without the batteries this camera won't do anything. You won't be able to fire the shutter, you won't be able to cock it after you release the shutter. So it's completely useless without batteries. So the first position turns it on. If you want to use the self timer, you have to push this little button in front of the battery switch, push it down and push it one notch further, and then it's in self timer mode. and it works as you would expect since it's an electronic camera. So it's cocked now. It's at a 60th of a second. Let me get into manual mode. It's really at a 60th of a second. If you click it, it helps the self-timer mode. You'll see the light flashing on the front. It's a really long self-timer. I think it's about 30 seconds long. And eventually it'll start flashing faster. Well, I guess it's 10 seconds long. And it takes the picture. So we'll get it back out of that mode. Now on the front, this is the lens release button, and this is the depth of field preview. When I first got this camera, I didn't think the depth of field preview worked. I fiddled with it, but it turned out it works fine. It's just you have to push really hard to do the depth of field preview, like that. I'll remove the lens. Simple bayonet lens. It's you can see the mirror mechanism inside. There is no mirror lockup mechanism. So this is an Albanar lens, and it's a 28mm, reasonable wide angle, but actually it's a macro lens, and it's really quite a nice macro lens, even though it's only 2.8. And in reality, the lenses in this era, if they were at f1.4 or a 1.8, they were not that sharp in the corners. This 2.8 is a really good lens all around. If I put this back in and lock it in, here's the aperture ring. What's really neat about this macro lens is when you start focusing close in, it shows the scales on the front as zoom magnifications. But also you'll notice it focuses to actually less than 8 inches. Now, that's 8 inches from the film plane to the image. So in fact, you're only a few inches away if you actually focus on something. So it's about that distance away. So it focuses incredibly close. It really is a good macro lens. I'm happy to have it. These Albanar lenses get sort of a mixed reputation. A lot of people think they're cheap lenses, and in some cases they are. It turns out that Albanar was never a manufacturer of lenses. They were just a distributor of lenses made by other manufacturers. Best Products, not to be confused with Best Buy, sold Albanars that were manufactured by Tokina Company Limited from Japan, which was actually composed or originally created from employees, former Nikon engineers that started that company and made lenses, many very good lenses, for many years. This particular macro, I think, is a pretty doggone well-made lens. This ML button is memory lock. So what that does is basically it's like the newer modern DSLs. If you wanted to focus on one image and then reframe, you would normally hold the shutter button halfway down to focus, then reposition your camera. Here you can focus on where you want it to lock the exposure, and then press the ML, the memory lock, which locks the exposure. You hold that down, then you reframe and take your picture wherever you want, and you have the exposure setting locked in. It lets go of the exposure setting as soon as you let go of the button. I could see where that would be kind of handy. On the bottom, there's where you load the battery. Here's the button for rewinding the film. When you rewind the film, of course, you have to have this little film rewind lever up, which is recessed, and you have to get your fingernail under it, and then you can rewind the film. Notice on the back there's also a window to see the film. Now, that's pretty unusual on a 35mm camera, but it's a neat feature, really. So here's how you release the film back. Just pull up on the rewind knob, it releases the film back. I'll show you a better picture of this film back. And here's where you put the cartridge in. Now, this takes DX film, which means that there's encoding on the side of the film. which tells it the ISO setting. So you don't ever have to set the ISO in this camera as long as you use DX film. If you use non-DX film, older film that doesn't have this encoding on the side, then it would default to 100 ISO. So you're stuck with either 100 ISO or films that have the DX coding, which is all modern films. And I'll show you a picture in here where the sensors are to pick up the DX markers, and you figure out how that goes. So DX encoding on film cartridges was developed by Kodak in 1983. The original idea was to help the processing lab so they could identify the film and the film tolerance for pushing it or pulling it for overexposed or underexposed, and also make it easier to determine how many exposures were on each roll. It allowed them to do some automatic sorting and processing on their machines. However, it became incredibly popular, and after it was introduced, all of the cameras started using it. They had some competition. Fuji had their own product for a while, but eventually everybody switched to this DX system. From Wikipedia, I got this legend and some charts. This shows the DX encoding method. And in the case of our film, which is Kodachrome ISO 25 and a 24 exposure roll, here we'll see how this is actually determined by the film cartridge. Here's a picture of where you do the ISO speed. We're at the top roll of 25 ISO, and here's a circle that indicates it. So we need the ground, 3 insulated conductors, and then a conductor at the 4th position, which is exactly what we have right here. This particular camera has all the sensors present, to include the film length, which in our case was 24 exposures, and also the tolerance, which is used by the labs. I assume from the film length, which is shown here, we would need 2 conductors and an insulator from ground, which is what we have right here, indicating the film length of 24 exposures. In this case, the camera would know enough to stop letting you wind it after you've taken 24 exposures. And you can see the rewinds going out, and again we're at position for picture number 1. Hold the rewind button and crank it back. And I'm not going to do that. I'll just take the film out the hard way because I want to reuse this roll of film for demo purposes. Cute little camera. Notice on the bottom, not sure if I have this right side up or not, when I bought it, it still had the plastic coating on the base plate and on the bottom here where the lens barrel would go. So it was kind of like a Christmas present, peeling off the plastic wrap. So that this camera looks brand new and works just fine. Here's a shot through the viewfinder. The aperture is selected P mode and the camera is selecting a 1-second exposure. Here's a viewfinder shot in manual mode where I have some aperture selected manually and the shutter speed is set to 2 seconds, but the red in the upper left hand corner is actually flashing and telling me to set it to 1/1000th of a second. The viewfinder here is in manual. The flashing is telling me to set it to 1/1000th of a second, and the shutter speed is set at 1/15th of a second. Well, that's it, guys. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoyed the video. Here's a shameless plug for my first book. It's available on all of the normal sources as an ebook, and if you wanted a hard copy, it's available on lulu.com. It's about cars and cameras and computers and airplanes and me.